everyone's talking right now about RICO cases, and we're starting to see a lot of celebrity RICO cases, politicians, gangsters, all this stuff. So we're going to talk about what are the elements of a RICO case. And I'm not just going to talk about the elements. I'm going to talk about what would a defense attorney, what would their strategy be if they had to defend against a RICO case. Okay, so all of these people here are recent, either have been convicted recently or have been charged recently with RICO cases. Okay, so let's walk through the elements. We have here Donald Trump, we have Epstein, we have this guy's a member of the Rolling 60s, which is a gang. His name is Big U, Eugene Henley. We have Puff Daddy, we have Young Thug, we have R. Kelly. R. Kelly was convicted under the RICO statute. We have a recent conviction of a white supremacist. He's from the Aryan Brotherhood. He got convicted. And then this woman down here, she and her husband are business owners in Georgia. Okay, so the first thing you need to know about RICO is that RICO can be civil or criminal. And if it's civil, that means that a person, another human being, can sue somebody under the RICO rules, versus criminal is when the state or the government is prosecuting you criminally. So this is how someone can both be prosecuted criminally, found guilty or not guilty, and they can also be sued by individual people, which I think is what's happening to P. Diddy, and certainly has happened to some of these other people. Okay, it also can be state or federal, right? So the big one, the big scary one that we always hear about, this is the federal RICO cases. But about 36 states also have their own state RICO laws that mimic the federal laws very closely. Okay, so what are the 5 elements of a RICO case, and what would defense attorneys be trying to say to combat these different elements? Okay, so the first element of a RICO case, right? And by element, I mean this is the first thing that the prosecutor has to prove is that there is the existence of an enterprise. Okay, and in enterprise, the courts have interpreted this so broadly that almost anything, not everything, but almost everything, can somehow be situated into this enterprise rule. Okay, so of course we have the legal entities. A corporation, an LLC, that's a sort of formal, recognized, established enterprise. It's hard to say that that's not an enterprise. But also, enterprise has been expanded to include an informal, what they call association in fact, and that's an actual legal term. It's an actual legal standard, right? So that would include things that are not legal entities, but like gangs, families, right? You see a lot of RICO prosecutions where like 13 cousins and 24 uncles, right? They all get captured at one time. So that's when you're going to get your family groups. You're going to get an activist group. And by activist, I don't think they mean like the people picketing on the street. I think they're talking about like the Black Panthers. They're talking about some of the supremacy groups, right? They're talking about these sort of formal groups who get into criminal activity. Could be talking about a motorcycle gang, and certainly the mafia. Now, RICO statutes were designed to capture mafia people, right? So it makes perfect sense that they would allow a prosecution to go forward even in the absence of a formal entity, because it was designed to catch the mafia, which is not organized under formal entities. And then loose-knit groups that don't even have a hierarchy at all. So you can see that this pretty much captures all groups of people, but we're going to get into how it doesn't even require a group to be an enterprise, okay? And then the next you have the purpose, structure, and continuity element. And so basically it's saying that this loose group of people has to have a common purpose, an ongoing structure, and we just saw that a structure can be very loose, and there needs to be some continuity in their behavior, meaning this cannot be a one and done thing. This can't be you and your neighbor accidentally fall into this definition of an enterprise, right? There has to be some kind of an ongoing something, continuity, etc. So this is designed not to capture one-off crimes. This is designed not to like people can't accidentally fall into this thing, right? There has to be some ongoing continuity there. Now, the courts have also said that an enterprise can exist even if it's entirely criminal, if it has no legal business component at all, right? So don't get confused by this word enterprise and think that it has to be a business, because the courts have said time and time again that it does not have to be a business. There doesn't have to be any actual business component to it, right? It can be entirely criminal in nature, and it's still considered an enterprise. Also, and here's the interesting one, because this last one is where a lot of people that you follow, how they're going to get captured in this, right? If one person owns a business, okay, the courts have said, in the Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court weighed in on this. You guys may remember the Don King case, right? When Don King was sued under the RICO statute. Okay, so Don King, of course, tried to say that there was no group of things, it was just him. The Supreme Court said that if your business is a separate entity from yourself, even if you're the sole owner of that business, you and the business are two separate things. Therefore, there's enough of it's basically a group, right? You and your business are the group. But here's the thing, the business has to be a separate legal entity. So if you're, for example, a sole proprietor, that means that you and your business are actually one and the same. And the court has said that you can't conspire with yourself to do something. But if you're not a sole proprietorship, if you're any other entity, then you and your business can count as an enterprise. Okay, so, and this is how they're going to get Puffy, right? Puffy owns a business and he is kind of the sole owner of the business, but because the business is a separate entity from him, it's not a sole proprietorship, the courts have found that this is enough to qualify. He is one person, he's conspiring with his business to satisfy this element of the crime. So now, once the courts have established that there is an entity, and of course, defense counsel is going to try to say that whatever this fact pattern is that we're dealing with, this doesn't amount to being an enterprise. Therefore, this whole statute doesn't apply to my client's activity. But the courts have dealt with this time and time again because everybody does that. Okay, so the second element of racketeering is that there has to be a pattern of this criminal activity. Okay, so how does the court define pattern? The court has said that if there are at least 2 qualifying acts within 10 years, you can establish a pattern. But it's not that simple, okay? So the 2 qualifying acts are called the predicate acts. And there's a list of what these predicate acts can be, okay? And it involves everything from murder, kidnapping, bribery. I should have made a list before I started telling you, but I mean, it literally, I think there's like 30 or 40 crimes on this list, and the list has expanded, right? As the law attempts to keep up with criminal activity, the list has expanded. Fraud, bribery, SA, pimping, right? There are cases of pimps, drug trafficking, and then the big ones, murder, kidnapping, robbery, burglary, home invasions, right? All of those things can be prerequisite crimes to this thing. Now, if they can find that 2 of these things have happened within 10 years, now that is a long, long time. The activities have to be related in nature, but they don't have to be close in time, right? So that element includes a lot of things. And you can see here that this does not require a whole lot of criminality. 2 acts over 10 years, right? This is very pro-prosecution, okay? But here's the thing. It can't just be 2 random acts. The 2 acts have to be related, and there has to be some continuity between them, okay? So it can't just be, oh, one act happened in year 1, and then another unrelated act happened in year 6 or something like that, and then the prosecution can say, hey, these are 2 related acts. No. The defense would say, right, if they can't, the first thing the defense is going to try to show is that there's no enterprise. The second thing that the defense is going to try to show is that the acts you're even talking about are not crimes, right? So this is what P. Diddy is trying to do right now. P. Diddy is trying to say he can't deny that the things happened because there's too much camera, too many witnesses, too much footage. But what he's going to say instead is these were not crimes. And so how he's doing that is he's going to say that there was no, that it was consensual, right? Because if the jury believes that these acts were consensual, they cannot find that they are the predicate crimes to sustain a RICO charge. So that's the first thing that they're going to do. They're going to try to say these acts are not even crimes. But then if they can't get around the whether or not these acts were crimes, right? If there's no question that these acts were crimes, The next thing the defense is going to try to do is they're going to try to dismantle the idea that these acts were a pattern. They're either going to say that there weren't enough of them, they were too far spread apart, and if they can't do that, right, like if the prosecution presents 20 examples within 2 years, that is no longer available to the defense. In that case, what the defense is going to try to show is that the acts are not related in the way that the RICO statutes are designed to capture, right? It's not the type of related behavior that RICO statutes are designed to capture. So what the defense has to do, what the prosecution is going to try to do is they're going to try to create a chain of events. They're going to try to like overwhelm the jury with all of these examples. And you'll see in the bottom that the prosecution doesn't have to prove any of the behaviors. They just have to show that there is this ongoing pattern of this behavior that we as a society don't like. The defense is going to try to say, yes, you're seeing these things, but they are not in fact related. They're going to try to break the prosecution's chain of events, okay? And then, like I said at the bottom, it said the prosecution does not have to prove any individual charge. Now, this also obviously is very pro-prosecution, right? The reason the prosecutor doesn't have to prove every individual charge is because in really egregious RICO cases, there are dozens, if not hundreds of charges, any one of which could require an entire trial, DNA evidence, witnesses, all this kind of stuff, right? So RICO charges are not about the one thing you did. They are about living a lifestyle of this, right? Creating a culture of this type of behavior. I want to go back here before we get into 3, 4, and 5. I want to talk about who are these guys? Like who even are these guys and what are they being charged with? Okay, so a number of these happened in Georgia, actually. Okay, so you can see Donald Trump. We know Donald Trump's story. Jeffrey Epstein. Now, Jeffrey Epstein. Remember, I told you that about 3 dozen states have their own state RICO laws. Jeffrey Epstein was not charged with federal RICO. He was charged under the equivalent of state RICO laws, but the U.S. Virgin Islands. So the U.S. Virgin Islands has its own version of the federal RICO statutes, and they call it CICO, C-I-C-A. So he was charged under the CICO laws in the Virgin Islands. Right below him is a gangbanger. He's from the Crips, the Rolling 60s. You may have heard of Eugene Henley. He has been charged with drugs, murder, the whole gang lifestyle. Then there's P. Diddy. He's been charged with sex crimes, sex trafficking, and they're going to try to build a RICO out of that. He is also charged with independent sex charges, which most RICO charges come with a host of other charges, so that if they don't make out the RICO, there are these other fallback charges. Okay, let's see who else is here. So up in the top he's a guy from the Aryan nation. Just recently, he and 2 of his comrades were convicted. There's about another dozen or so of them that are about to be prosecuted under this. He was sentenced to life in prison. And then there's R. Kelly. R. Kelly was sentenced to all kinds of bad behaviors with women. And then this woman down here, she and her husband are business owners. They own a recycling plant in South Georgia, and they were charged with running a ring of catalytic converter theft, right? Hundreds, thousands of catalytic converters were stolen and processed through their recycling plant. Okay, so this is sort of the range of activities that can capture people. Okay, so the third element is that the conduct or that the defendant, their conduct or participation in the enterprise's affairs. Okay, so the defendant must play an integral role. They must conduct or participate directly or indirectly in the operation or the management of the enterprise. So it requires some control or direction, not mere association. Again, a RICO charge is not something that you stumble into, right? These little clauses that you can't just be associated, right? You must be kind of steering the ship a little bit. So you don't stumble into, accidentally get charged with, oops, it's a misidentification, right? That does not happen with RICO cases. And the other thing is that outsiders like accountants, consultants, lawyers, they can be liable if they play a managing role in the racketeering activity. So you may remember that Trump's co-defendants, a number of them were sort of outsiders. They were adjacent to his main enterprise, and some of them were convicted. This is how they get them. But there's a standard, there's a threshold. They have to actually be participating in the activities. They have to be covering up for it in the accounting. They have to be a lawyer who's forging things like that. That's how they play a managing role. And then the last thing is being a part of the enterprise, right? So we already talked about it's not enough to be associated with the enterprise. It's not enough to just be a service provider to the enterprise, but this is also saying that just being a part of the enterprise, being an employee, for example, is not enough to trigger the RICO statutes, right? You have to actually be playing an integral role. And we saw that in Donald Trump's prosecution. Okay, so this part here, right? So we've already established that there was a pattern of activity. Now the prosecution has to prove that this pattern of activity aided or furthered the enterprise. Now, this is the part that is confusing to a lot of people. How can you say that R. Kelly, for example, how can you say that his personal sexual predilections, his particular preferences, how can you say that advanced or furthered the goal of his business? The courts have said that if the goal of the business is to establish brand recognition, power, or revenue, if anything you do leads to revenue, leads to deepening of your power or your brand, it can be deemed to be in furtherance of the goals of the enterprise. Of course, what the defense counsel is going to say, they failed at everything else, now they're here. They're going to say, no, okay, you got us. We committed these things, but they were not in furtherance of the goal of the enterprise, right? How can you say that Puff Daddy's freak-offs were furthering the goals of the enterprise? Well, the courts have already dealt with this, and they have said if it leads to power, if it leads to revenue, if it leads to your brand, your reputation, all of those are goals of a business. And so if what you did furthers any of those, power, right? Abusing someone leads to power, the courts have said that that is enough. So there must be a causal link. Now, if the defense counsel is successful, bullet point 3 says, if someone commits crimes, but only for personal gain and not for the benefit of the enterprise, then the RICO laws may not apply. So this is what the defense counsel is going to be hinge their defense on if they have failed all the previous elements. So the pattern of activity must functionally advance the enterprise's goal. And this is the one that most people find the hardest to accept. Especially when you're talking about the bad behavior of the owner of the business, right? Like what they do in their personal life, the courts have been able to find that. Now, you'll notice that everyone that I have presented here has been men. And I got to tell you, I searched far and wide looking for women who have been convicted or even charged with RICO cases. And there were some cases that I remembered, and I thought, surely these people had to be charged with RICO. And here's the only 2 cases where I have found that women have even been charged with RICO, let alone convicted. 2 examples. The first one is when they get into it with their husband. So there are some like family businesses where the husband and wife are both charged and convicted. The only other example that I saw where women get, first of all, atta girl. If you can figure out how not to get charged with this, atta girl. I have no feeling about this whatsoever. But the only other time that I saw women being charged with or convicted of RICO was in politics. And every single time, the woman was on the staff of a male politician. So the lesson here is, women, if you're going to commit RICO type crimes, don't do it with men, because as soon as you involve a man, I'm kidding. But this is true. This is what I found. The only 2 times that women were convicted under the RICO statutes or even charged, 1, when her husband was also charged, like in a family business, or 2, when she was on the political staff of some man who also was charged in the RICO. So do women get convicted in those 2 cases? Yes. Okay, so the 5th element of a federal RICO charge. Now, let me say this. RICO is enabled by the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, of the US Constitution. And it is the Commerce Clause which gives Congress the right, A, to write legislation that criminalizes this activity. What triggers the Commerce Clause is interstate activity or foreign commerce. So what that means is, in order to be brought into the RICO statute, your criminal activity has to affect commerce, even if it's indirectly. Now, if you know anything about constitutional law, this clause has been interpreted to cover so much activity. It is not hard to establish interstate activity. Okay, so federal jurisdiction is easily satisfied, especially as we move into the digital age. So phone calls, right? When you pick up the phone and you call somebody, the courts have said you are engaging in interstate commerce, even if you're calling your cousin around the corner. Wire transfers, right? Because the bank is always in some other state from where you are. The phone company is, the wires that connect the call are somewhere else. Travel for sure. That was sort of the traditional one, right? If you transport a body across state lines, federal jurisdiction applies. If you carry drugs from Chicago to Houston, right, you cross state lines, now it's a federal jurisdiction. Also, the courts have said business materials, right? This could be your website, this could be any of these things. So it is not hard for the federal government to take over RICO charges if they want to. They don't always want to, but sometimes they do. Also, nonprofit groups and activist collectives, right? These are not people that you typically think of as criminals, but they can still affect commerce through selling goods, buying goods, shipping signs, different services, digital platforms. So all of these things can bring you under the federal jurisdiction. It is not hard. But here's the thing. Even an enterprise operating entirely within one state can qualify if it has interstate connections. This part of the rule is so pro-prosecution, you're rarely going to see a defendant arguing this thing, right? If you just think about the activities that you've done today in your life, you have already, had you committed a crime today, you have already satisfied this, okay? This is not hard. Defense is not going to waste time on this. Okay, so remember when I said the only time that I see women is when they do it with their husband or when they do it with a politician? So these are all women that, when I was brainstorming a quick list, I was like, surely one of these women has to have been charged with RICO statute. So in the very lower right-hand corner is Griselda Marcos, right? She is considered the cocaine queen pen. There's been movies and series and whatnot made about her. She's alleged to have killed dozens of people in the course of her enterprise, millions, hundreds of millions of dollars. She was not prosecuted under RICO and could have been. Right next to her is Heidi Fleiss. You guys might remember the Hollywood Madam. She had men all over the US and international. She was a madam. Now, pimping can trigger RICO statutes, but for some reason, the Hollywood Madam did not. Right next to her is Elizabeth, oh my God, what's her last name? The woman from Theranos, multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical scam, right? She was the one who was recently prosecuted and sentenced based on forging the blood results of, basically they accused her of running a medical Ponzi scheme almost. She was not prosecuted under RICO. Now these three women all the way to the left, you guys may remember there was a case in Virginia where these three women ran a multi-million-dollar coupon scam. Coupons, right? Leave it to women. They figured out a way to scam coupons. Multi-million-dollar enterprise, cross state lines. They were not prosecuted under RICO. In the back, some of you may be old enough to remember Leona Helmsley. She was the hotel tax fraud. So let me say that. Just because these women, or just because anybody is not charged under RICO, they can certainly be charged under tax fraud. They can be charged for conspiracy. They can be charged with regular sexual assault. They can be charged. There's a whole host of other ways to charge them where they would be charged for individual crimes as opposed to a pattern of behavior, which RICO is designed to keep prosecutors from having to to prosecute individual charges, right? They're charging a pattern. They're charging a culture of criminality that has been created. Leona Helmsley, if you remember her, she was the hotel maven, or whatever the word that you would use. She was charged with a lot of things, a massive thing, but she was not charged with RICO. And the RICO laws go back to the 70s, and they were designed to catch mobsters. Her crimes happened. She could have been charged with RICO. They certainly fit the bill. She was not. The other people that I thought women was, you might see Felicity Hoffman. These two, if you remember, they were the school admissions scandal. And while they may not have been the pure masterminds, they certainly could have, that entire operation could certainly have been charged under RICO. And RICO is, when you watch the news reports and you see a wall of faces, there's like 20 or 30 faces, and they'll say the cops busted this ring of something. All of those people are the people who acted. They may not have been the masterminds, but they were involved in carrying out the thing. So in that school admissions scandal, all of those parents could have been involved, possibly. These two women were not. There was another case that you guys may have heard of. It was men. They were prosecuted and convicted. They were stealing cars, and they had a stolen car ring, and they stole like thousands of cars. Those men were convicted. So the RICO statutes, they have gotten drug cartels. Whole police departments have been charged with RICO, right? Atlanta police, New York City police, Los Angeles police have been charged with RICO. Gwinnett County, that's also a suburb of Atlanta, they have been charged under the RICO statutes. The mafia, for sure. Corporations can be charged, right? So you don't even have to be a person. The whole corporation can be charged. Certainly celebrities are being charged. Sex offenders are being charged. Protesters, technology company executives are being charged. Pharmaceutical executives are being charged. Wall Street firms have been prosecuted under RICO. Street gangs, for sure. Hedge funds have been charged under RICO. I'm trying to think who else has been charged under RICO. So a law that was designed to capture the mob has been expanded to so many people. Now, here's the thing. Part of what prosecutors will do with RICO is they're not even going to necessarily end up charging you with the thing, but just the threat of it. When you hear RICO, people think that RICO is like the worst possible charge you can find because it's so hard to beat. But here's the thing, they are actually quite hard to prosecute. So a lot of people get charged with RICO, go through whole trials, and they get off. Because if defense counsel can break this chain in any of the 5 places that we just talked about, and each of the 5 places can be broken in a number of ways. If defense counsel can, right, the prosecution has to make all of them out, and they're gonna bring the weight of the federal government to it. Defense counsel just has to break one of them in the mind of one juror. The prosecution has to make out all 5 of them for all 12 or 9 or however many jurors there are. They cannot make a mistake. The defense counsel just has to break the chain in the mind of one juror. Okay, so this is the 101 introduction to the RICO charges. So when you hear everyone is talking about this, these are the things that they're talking about. And again, I'll just go through what defense is going to do. Defense is going to try to establish that there was no enterprise. There was no common purpose, no ongoing structure, no continuity. And they're going to try to say that our guy is one guy. He's not an enterprise. But the courts have already dealt with that, so that could be very difficult. The next thing they're going to say is, then they're going to try to say there was no crime. The activities that you're talking about, even if they did happen, there was no crime. If they can't establish that there was no crime, they'll concede that there was crime, but then they'll say, and now the defense is arguing all these things simultaneously, because when the jury goes back with it, they're going to take all of these things, right? So in one trial, the defense is going to try to establish that there was no crime. They're also going to try to establish that even if, jury, you happen to find that these things were crimes, well, there certainly was no pattern, right? They're not related. There's no continuity between the things. So when the jury goes in the back, they're going to have to weigh in on all of these pieces in the chain. At any point that the chain is broken in the mind of the juror, they're going to acquit. So the defense is going to send them back with a way to break each of the elements at the same time. And the jury will deal with each charge and each counter one after the other. So then the next thing they're going to try to say is that even if these things happened, right, even if you decide that there was a pattern of activity, right, even if you decide there was a crime, even if you decide there was a pattern of crimes, okay, fine, jury, but they weren't advancing, right? They weren't advancing the goals of the enterprise. They're going to say that these things are not related to the business function or not related to the core goal or cause of the enterprise. They're going to try to break the chain between the activities and the furtherance of the goals. And then the last thing, this thing is super duper hard. They're not going to waste much time on this, but they're going to say, here's how they will attack the interstate thing. They're going to argue, defense is going to argue, now this is not going to be effective, but we all do it. Defense is going to argue that the spirit of this rule, right? This is not the kind of behavior that this rule, this law was created to capture. Yes, technically it satisfies that element, but this is not even why we created this rule. This is just a coincidence that this behavior happens to represent interstate commerce, right? So that's what the defense is going to do. And you guys, prosecutors will throw around the RICO because they either want to negotiate or because they want you to be afraid, they want you to turn on somebody else, right? They'll say, if you don't turn on this guy, we're going to pull you into this RICO thing. And it often works. But like I said, they have to convince a whole room full of jurors that every single element is made. The defense can get out of it if they can convince one juror that the chain does not apply. Okay, so that's all I have. Thanks you guys for tuning in. I will see you in the next one.